Paying for care in later life can seem like a daunting task, and a recent scrapping of the cap on how much you could pay could be making it even harder. Welcome to Which Money? Hello, I'm Lucia Ariano, and joining us today we have Which senior researcher, Megan Thomas. Hello, Megan.
Hi.
And also Mel Kenny, Chartered Financial Planner at Radcliffe and Newlands Wealth. Hello, Mel.
Hello.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us for this one. Shall we start with a bit of background then on kind of what I mentioned at the top? So there were big plans a few years ago, I believe, to implement a cap on how much we could end up paying. Something's changed now, hasn't it, Megan? Can you talk us through it?
Yeah, so in 2021, the government announced a plan to introduce an £86,000 cap on how much you would pay for care in your lifetime. Basically because it's this huge issue, the cost of care. And a lot of people are saying, something needs to be done. So this was their kind of big plan. But in July last year, the incoming government scrapped that plan. And the previous government had kind of been pushing it into the distance for some time before that as well. At the moment, the government's launched a consultation to look at a national care service, but we won't hear any of the recommendations from that until 2028.
That's quite some time away. And as well as the scrap of the cap, there's also rising costs generally, isn't there?
Yeah, so the cost of care has outpaced inflation for 2 decades now, according to a market research firm called Lang Buisson. So yeah, things like energy costs increasing, as we've all felt, is being felt massively in the sector of care. There's struggle with recruitment and things like that. House prices, so, the buildings themselves, all these prices are massively rising, and then so too are the cost of care.
And Mel, with all of this in mind, which is a lot already, we've literally only just begun, for people thinking, OK, so when is the right time to start planning? What would your advice be?
Well, that's a big question. And many would argue, young people should be thinking about this. But the problem for young people is building enough money for a standard retirement, let alone perhaps needing to pay for care, which may not happen. But if it did happen, there is the potential for catastrophic costs. Now, what would be great would be to have a proposition whereby there's a pre-funded insurance plan that you can pay into in the event that catastrophic costs arise. But that didn't really take off. It did. It lasted for some years, but there was not enough policyholders. Young people were wanting to pay into their pension plan, and older people wanted, it was very expensive for older people to pay into this type of plan. And they had their property to fall back on by then. So they left it to their property. Then the event of Facebook came along and adverts about how the local authority were going to take away your home to pay for your care. And then suddenly older people were wanting to enter into these protective trusts that prevented them from having to pay for their care and pushing them at the risk of having nothing and the local authority paying, which is not a great scenario to be in. The local authority will provide care, that's their duty, but to their standard of care, which may not be to your standard.
Well, shall we start breaking down then how we pay and how we work out, or how the council works out if they will pay or if we'll pay or self-fund? So shall we start then, from right at the top? Depending on your postcode, you might end up paying a different amount. Is that right?
Yeah, so the cost of care varies quite a lot depending on where you live, and that tracks quite similarly to house prices. So it'll be cheapest in the northeast on average. So again, Lottie, which is a company that looks at different care providers as sort of a search engine, provided this data that for residential care in the northeast, you'd pay £1,076 a week. Compare that to London, where house prices are most expensive. That tracks with care, where you'd expect to pay £1,710 a week. So there can be these huge differences. And that's just residential care. You'll also pay more for nursing care, which requires more staffing, and dementia care, which is the same.
And what's the difference then between self-funding and the council paying? And when do the council get involved?
Well, the council get involved if you have assets of under £23,250 and you do not have enough income to pay for your care. So there are many different types of care situations. Megan described how much it could cost. Margaret Thatcher decided to live out her last years in the Ritz. And if you were to do that today, it would cost you £1,000 a night, which is £365,000 a year, plus your carers. That's a lot of money. And you don't need to be paying that sort of money. You can pay just over £200,000 only for an absolutely fantastic care home. You can pay £100,000 a year, and you'd be getting a pretty good care home. You'd still be getting a very good care home, possibly £80,000 and £70,000. So it's up to you as to how much you want to pay. But if you're looking at not wanting to depart with too much money because you're thinking about, well, I want to leave my assets to my children, they're the most important thing to me, and I expect the government to pay because I pay taxes, I pay national insurance and so on, and they'll probably get me on inheritance tax later on or something like that, then it's social care is means tested. Yeah. So if you have more than £23,250 in assets, you're expected to pay if you do not have enough income to pay for your care. And there's different rules around how much you pay if you're living at home and if you're in a care home.
And that 23, I think you said, is that for England? And does it vary depending on whether you're in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so for Wales, it's actually £50,000.
It's quite a big difference.
Yeah, and then in Scotland, so there's a lower and upper limit, but the lower limit in Scotland is £21,500.
And you mentioned earlier whether or not your house could be taken away from you to pay for costs. Can we just go into, I mean, it's quite a minefield, isn't it? But can we go into, how this works, whether or not, the council takes into account the cost, the value of your home?
Yeah, so it depends on some certain factors. So for the first 12 weeks that you're in a care home, the council disregard the cost of your house in assessing your finances. And that's true also if you go in, so respite care, so you're not usually living in a care home, but if you have a carer at home, sort of giving them a bit of a break, you might go into a care home for a few weeks. Again, they wouldn't consider the cost of your home. There are also specific circumstances where they won't consider it. So if your spouse or partner still lives in the home, if a relative aged 60 or over, or a child of yours who's under 18 or incapacitated, which is basically defined by they take certain disability benefits. In these instances, your property would also be disregarded. Otherwise, they'll count it.
And you mentioned earlier, I can't think the word you used, but funds that you could pay into to kind of protect your home. I mean, is that something that people are doing or that they're thinking about?
So I was talking about these protective trusts that some are entering into, and you have to be really careful when you do this sort of thing. A paper may not have any value at all, let alone the actual trust. Yeah, so it's really important to take legal advice from a good solicitor or a financial advisor. Run this sort of thing by someone who's familiar with this sort of territory, a financial advisor who's accredited by the Society of Later in Life Advisors. They are more likely to see whether this is best suited to your needs. Sometimes they do work, and if they do, well, you're going to be vulnerable to what the local authority deems to be suitable for your care. And if they don't work, well, you just handed over a lot of fees to a legal person who didn't have your best interests at heart.
And I suppose our listeners might be thinking, well, I wouldn't want to give up my house. Maybe it's got sentimental value. You just don't want to sell it. What's the answer there?
Well, so you can have care at home. So as much as the care cap was never really implemented, it was meant to come around at the Care Act 2014, because this care cap goes back nearly 15 years now. And in 2014, some great things came out of that Care Act. You could have a deferred payment agreement against your house, is another topic. But it also the well-being principle and promoting independence and your ability to stay in your own home and for the council to support it. So if things are getting a bit tricky at home, it doesn't mean you have to be shipped off to a care home. If you haven't got enough money to pay for your care in your own home, the council will come out and perform a care needs assessment. And if your needs are there, they're legible needs, and you do not have enough money, then the council would support you. And if you don't have enough, and that support would be that if you don't have enough income to pay for that care, they will top it up. And you'll always be left with a minimum income guarantee because you still have to pay energy and perhaps council tax. But there's a severe mental impairment exemption on council tax. So it's really important to be taking financial advice because there's lots of exemptions out there. There's a lot of planning that you could take into account. You could also on top of the help you get from the local authority, on top of that, take out a lifetime mortgage, which takes equity out of your property and can top up what the local authority give you, because perhaps what they want to give you is not enough for the lovely carers that you've had in place. And that's fantastic for those who, as you say, has been in their own home for perhaps 40 years, that they planted their apple tree 40 years ago and they take the apple from that tree every summer. Is something that's very, very difficult to depart from. It's part of their identity, of who they are. And you take that person away from their home, that it can be a very difficult situation.
I mean, you said so much there that I want to talk about. Can we just pick up on the deferred payments agreement, which people might have heard that term used around. So is this something that still exists?
Absolutely. So what the Care Act 2014 did was compel local authorities to offer this deferred payment agreement. So if you had to go to a care home and your house was empty, you no longer had to sell your house to pay for your care. And this is what Tony Blair wanted in 1997. He stood up and said, I no longer want to live in a country where people have to sell their homes to pay for their care. And some 18 years later, we got it. Mm-hmm. And what that meant was you moved to a care home, the house is empty, you did not have to sell it to pay for it. A debt could be applied to the house, which would eventually have to be repaid, and that would typically be upon death, unless someone in the family wanted to pay off that debt. So you might not have to sell it in your lifetime, but you might have to sell it upon your demise.
Is it common that you might choose to do this and your fees your debts could be worth more than the value of your property?
Now, there's certain protective procedures in place, both with a deferred payment agreement and with a lifetime mortgage. So that won't happen.
So my head's just going to all these different possibilities where, you might be in one of the more expensive care homes and then you might have to, scale down. Is that something
you've made a good point. So you can put the shortfall in the cost of care against the value of the house. But the local authority will only lend up to their costed care rate. Yeah. So if they believe that you may have £20,000 coming in, and they believe they could provide your care in a care home for £60,000, then they will allow a £40,000 debt to be applied against your property each year. If you want to go to a £100,000 care home that has lots of activities, there's furry animals coming in, they're celebrating VE Day really well, and they've got virtual headsets and they're having an absolutely fantastic time. On the big days, they might have butler in the buff and all those sort of things. It does happen.
Really?
Yeah. If you want to be doing it, the council's not going to pay for that. So you would have to look for a third-party top-up. So you would need to lean on your family for that. Or if there's no chance of a third-party top-up, then you're looking to sell the house. And you have a lump sum of capital, and you will be able to perhaps afford that £100,000 care home from the proceeds of that property. And the worry there, however, is, you you might run out of money. If the property is worth £500,000 and you're, I said you had income of 20, you'd be claiming a tenant's allowance, of course, and the cost is 100, and it's an £80,000 difference. You wouldn't want to live more than 6 years. You wouldn't want to enjoy yourself too much. So what you would look to do there is contain the cost of care with what they call immediate needs annuity, where you give a lump sum of money to an insurer in exchange for a guaranteed income for the rest of your life. They'll guarantee that £80,000, no matter how long you live, and give you the peace of mind that it's paid for.
And can we bring in then inheritance tax now? Our listeners might be wondering, okay, well, can I start gifting? How? And gifting is obviously a term we use a lot with inheritance tax. How does it differ? And how do the rules differ upon what you can give? And how? Yeah, let's bring in inheritance tax. What's your advice here?
Well, you, of course, you can gift, and you really need to. If you're sitting down with a financial advisor here, I would be looking at who's driving this. Who's driving this? Is this what mum and dad wants? Do they want to be gifting, or grandma, who perhaps is more vulnerable in a situation, or is it little Johnny? Is little Johnny wanting his money now, and he's been a little bit demanding, and it might put grandma at unease because she realised that she wants those extra savings for when she might need it herself. So we need to look at the situation as a financial advisor as to whether grandma or mum and dad should be gifting. Normally, the people put their children first or their grandchildren first, and would look to gift as much as possible. But you need to be careful about whether you might need that money later. And if you are gifting with the purpose of perhaps depriving your estate of assets, thereby falling below the 23,000 mark, so the local authority pays, then if you ever did need care, the local authority would look back on this situation and said, no, we're going to treat you as still having that money. So if little Johnny spent it as well, it's going to be a very tricky situation. So it's good to take advice. And if you don't take advice, then there are things that could go wrong if you're doing it on your own.
It must be quite difficult for councils to work out if it's an acceptable amount given away, because I know with inheritance tax rules, it seems a little bit clearer. You have 7 years, if I'm correct, up until the point where you die. Is that correct?
I think that's right.
But in this case, it's not so clear cut, is it?
No, it's very much at the discretion of the council. So I've heard instances where one person has gifted an amount to a child, and that's been fine. But in a neighbouring council, someone had done something similar because they'd heard their friend had done it in a different council, and it was fine, and they had been kind of pulled up for deliberate deprivation of assets. So I think always, to be honest, err on the side of caution, because they don't have to give a specific, as long as they can justify it themselves. There's not a specific set of rules they have to meet for what counts, essentially.
There really is an awful lot to think about here. And I am conscious that this might be a difficult question to answer, that the answer might be no. But for our listeners wondering, are there any ways that I can reduce the cost of my care home bill?
Well, it would be to either have a care home with less activities. And if you have less activities, you'll have a less fulfilled life. And you might have a very miserable end to your stay here on planet Earth. So you've got to be really careful of depriving yourself of having enough money to pay for your care. And I would always say, build up assets, build up assets, build up assets. And then when at the point of you might need care, or you do need care, because not everyone needs care. We don't know until the point comes. But if you've got that money, you've got choices. And with that, if you want to make sure that you don't end up facing catastrophic costs and losing all what you built up, then that's where you look at those annuities and a different form of care cap. It's the government care cap was only covering care costs, personal care costs. Whereas an immediate needs annuity can cover not just the personal costs, but the hotel costs, all the costs. So that would be my direction. If you are looking to pay as little as possible, then you need to be giving away your assets very early, okay? Because if the local authority gets a sniff of you thinking that you might need care later in life because you've gone to the doctor and they'll find out, or you're showing signs of perhaps needing care later on, and you've given away that money, then they'll treat you as still having that money. Nothing to do with 7 years. They can go back as long as they like. They are strapped for money, and it's getting worse. I mean, one of the reasons why the cap and care cost was shelved was because the Labour said it will cost £30 billion over the next 10 years to do that cap, as well as the other arrangements that were in place. And the cost on the local authority would have been huge. To get that clock ticking on paying for care, everyone would need to have gone through a care needs assessment. That's a lot of money.
And Megan, is there anything that you'd add to that?
Yeah, again, it's less about reducing the bill and other ways that you could help to fund it. So it's definitely worth checking if you're eligible for any benefits. If you're in a care home, you're most likely eligible for attendance allowance, but it could be pension credit or other types of benefits. And then there's a chance that you could get support for your funding from the NHS. This is difficult to get. Most people who apply don't get this. But there's NHS continuing healthcare and NHS funded nursing care, which can pay sort of flat rates each week depending on for the people who have the most severe and complex health needs. So that could be an avenue worth looking into.
And what about things like other household bills, council tax or anything else like that you might be able to save money on?
Yeah, well, if you're living with dementia, then you ought to be going to the council and claiming the severe mental impairment exemption on council tax, and that's a huge help. So some council tax amounts are a huge amount, and if you're living alone, then there's the single person's discount as well.
And we've covered so much today. What seemed like a daunting topic, I'm not sure if it seems more or less daunting. But, for anyone kind of worrying or just generally, what reassurance would you give people, starting to plan or thinking ahead?
Well, we're all waiting on Baroness Casey. She's got a very busy time at the moment by the looks of things. And she's to report next year on a 10-year plan, and then a long-term plan in 2028. But there's another general election due in 2029, so we can't really rely on what the government's going to do. The chances are the can's going to be kicked. It's been kicked for the last 15 years, and it's probably kicked even more. Lots of policies based on who shouts the loudest, and unfortunately, those who are in care find it difficult to shout. Actually, on that point, to be able to shout, you need to have a lasting power of attorney in place. Yeah, a lasting power of attorney, especially if you've lost your mental capacity, gives you a voice. Yeah, it gives you a voice. So it's important to have one of those in place. In terms of dealing with your own finances, you can do it alone. There's lots of information on the internet these days, and with AI and so on. It's not all accurate, and sometimes you could be acting off something which is incorrect. So I would say, if you're going to be serious about making sure your ducks are in the row, you really should be taking financial advice. A financial advisor who's accredited by the Society of Later Life Advisors is more likely to be aware of the issues around later life and paying for care. And you should be at the very least reassured that either you're doing the right thing right now, things you could be doing, or things you really ought to be actioning. And what you'll have at the end of that process is a greater likelihood of having peace of mind and being less affected by all the noise out there, what you're seeing on Facebook, you know you can lean on the independent financial advisor who's abreast of the situation and can hold your hand.
Megan, what would you add?
Well, I absolutely agree with Mel there. Yeah, it's about doing what you can to plan ahead so it doesn't catch you off guard, because especially, if someone in your family is going into care, that's such a stressful and, distressing time, that to put the weight of all this complex planning on it just then for the first time is something I think you'd really want to avoid.
This has been a really important episode. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Which, the UK's consumer champion. You can find plenty more advice about what we discussed today in the show notes. There you'll also find a link to become a Which member for 50% off the usual price, an offer exclusively available to you, our podcast listeners. Joining Which will not only give you access to our product reviews, our app, one-to-one personalised buying advice, and every issue of Which magazine across the year, but you'll also be helping us to make life simpler, fairer and safer for everyone. Don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. That way you'll be notified whenever we release a new episode of Which Money, Which Shorts, or any other podcast that we make for you. And if you want to get in touch with us, then follow us on social media at Which UK or drop us an email to podcast@which.co.uk. See you next time.